It's kind of like this. Like when you buy a car, do you start to see that car everywhere?
Yes. Yes.
So here's a question. Before you had that car, you didn't see it everywhere, right?
No.
But it was there. But once you have it, then you start to pay attention to it, but you also don't pay attention to all the cars that are around you. You don't notice those. So that's what labeling does.
Hi, everyone. This is Vicky Schettini, and I am really, really excited today. I got Dr. Benjamin Hardy, and I'm going to let him tell us more about his amazing book because I'm going to learn a lot of new things today. Thank you, Dr. Benjamin, for being on the show.
Awesome. Well, grateful to be here with you. Absolutely. So this book is called Personality Isn't Permanent. And kind of our conversation went a certain way because I was talking about personality tests like Myers-Briggs, Enneagram, tests like that. And I was talking about why they were non-useful and why they were not scientific. You were saying you didn't really hear me correctly. And you're like, oh, I love those tests. I use them all the time. And I said, provide you a different perspective. Maybe I'm okay if you don't agree with the perspective I share, but I'm going to explain to you why I don't think that they're useful, nor are they scientific. And then you got all excited. So I'm going to explain to you kind of why these tests are not useful, but there's so much more to this book than just personality tests, but there's a lot of important information in here. Basically, in order for a test, so when I got my PhD in organizational psychology, one of the things we studied was test development. And there are different measures in psychology for certain things. But they said that all of my professors repeatedly stated to me that tests like Myers and Briggs, and basically any test that categorizes someone into a type, like you're a blue, or you're a white, or you're a red, or you're an ENFJ or whatever, any test that puts people into a type, especially these types of tests they don't meet the demands of a scientific test. So they would need to be valid types, and they would also need to be reliable, meaning that first off, the test is saying that it's measuring what it says it does, but second off, every time you take the test, you would need to get a reliable score. But what you just said is that if you took a test in one situation and if you took it into another, you'd get two different scores. So therefore it's not reliable. It's really bad for your identity to overly assume a label. But there's been a lot of research on personality tests and things like that over time. And what the research shows is that the gap between when you take these tests, the longer and longer the gap, the less correlated they'll be. So as an example, do you think you're the exact same person you were 10 years ago?
Definitely not. No.
You're not the exact same person?
Physically, yes, not mentally.
So, so you don't even think you're the same person. And actually, truth be told, if you took a personality test, one of your favorites 10 years ago, if you took it today, you would be two fundamentally different scores. And so what the research also shows, and it really resonates with what you just said, is that the conditions really determine the score you get. So for example, there was one study where the participants were broken up into two groups. One of the groups, they took the same test twice over a couple week period of time with the same test administrator. And 2 weeks is not a very long period of time. You probably would get a similar score in 2 weeks. And those people got similar scores on both tests. But in the other group, they took the same test, same interval of time, couple weeks, but there was two different test administrators. That was the only difference. And just by making that one difference, the tests were actually totally non-correlated.
Really?
Whenever you take on a label, then you become very mindless to all of the times when the label is not true. So if you think you're depressed, then you will think you're always depressed, when in reality, many times throughout the day, you're actually quite fine, you're happy, but you don't notice those times. It's kind of like this. When you buy a car, do you start to see that car everywhere?
Yes. Yes.
So here's a question. Before you had that car, you didn't see it everywhere, right?
No.
But it was there. But once you have it, then you start to pay attention to it, but you also don't pay attention to all the cars that are around you. You don't notice those. So that's what labeling does. It creates tunnel vision. You start to see what matches the label and you ignore everything else, even though everything else is actually there. You just don't see it because what's relevant to you is the label. So labeling creates tunnel vision. And a big problem with this is that once you've assumed a label, you actually assume that it's your true identity. You assume it's who you actually are. And what the research shows is that, first off, you're not the same person you were 10 years ago. Also, you're not going to be the same person in 10 years or even 3 or 4 or 5 years. Your future self is going to be different than your current self. But if you've overly assumed a label, then you're not going to think that you're going to think that you're going to be the same person in the future. You're going to then stop proactively seeking change. You're also then what you're going to do is you're going to start setting goals that reinforce the label. You're going to start pursuing a life that reinforces the person you think you are because of this label. And so the label then becomes the determining factor for the goals you set, rather than having your desired future, whatever that may be the determining factor for the person you become. It's sort of funny, but it's not that funny, but it's ish funny. So like right now we're recording this in the midst of the coronavirus, right? And so we're kind of like tucked up inside. Well, in a recent email I sent to my email list, I used the word viral, not thinking about it. I was talking about like an article or something, that this is going viral or something. And a handful of people emailed me and said, you probably shouldn't use that word right now, right? Yeah. It triggered some people, but the idea is that word meant something different than it did like 5 weeks ago. If I had sent that email 5 weeks ago, no one would have thought about it, right?
Correct.
And so this is an example of how context matters more than content, right? The content is the word. In one context, 5 weeks ago, different meaning. In this situation right now with the coronavirus, the content has a totally different meaning. And so context matters more than content. And so one of the big problems again with these tests and with taking on a label is that it ignores context. You assume that it's always true, but in different situations, you're going to be a different version of you. Your memory is more based on your context. It's more based on your view. Like memory is supposed to change. Memory is flexible. But often when people have a bad experience. So this is why you would need mentoring and coaching and help, because you're going to hit some ceiling. And if you don't get support reframing it as, look, you can get through this. Like, yeah, it was tough, but you can keep learning, you can keep going, and helping you be flexible towards your emotions rather than internalizing your emotions and forming a story and a fixed mindset that you can't do it. It's like, no, you still got this. We'll get you there. If you don't have that empathetic witness, then you're going to form a false narrative about yourself, and it's going to limit your future. People say is that personality is often a byproduct of trauma, unresolved trauma. And so think about it. When you have a bad experience, if you don't reframe it and resolve it, then you avoid it.
And that's amazing. I just love what you're saying, because everything you're saying, I'm pretty sure you guys out there, I'm not the only one that's had something like this happen.
We all have. We've all had traumas. Even small or big ones, yeah. And we form little narratives about ourselves that then drive our goals and what we think we're interested in.
Sounds good. Great. Thank you so much for being on this show. And I'm really excited. We're going to talk about this too, guys.
It was an absolute pleasure.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.